Welcome everyone to this workshop on how to use the new edition of the Senior English Writing Handbook to in particular teach a creating texts unit. My name is James. Some of you might have been to my presentations before about VC English. I used to be an English teacher in the country at Wangaratta High School, but for the last 10 years now, I've been running workshops for Ticking Minds, a lot of them about VC English. Today, I want to talk about our new edition of the Senior English Writing Handbook. Some of you might have the current 4th edition, which essentially has the same front cover. The new edition significantly changes the creating texts chapter, and that's because we've now had a couple of years to see how creating texts is being taught, and we have got some more effective strategies to share with students and teachers about how to engage with this area of study. So throughout this short presentation today, I'm going to look at 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to look at some of the challenges in teaching a creating texts unit. Then I'm going to look at unit design principles for a unit on creating text that meets these challenges. And I'm going to talk about how the layout of the creating text chapter in the Senior English Writing Handbook meets these challenges. And finally, I'm going to give you some examples of how you would use this chapter across a unit and across individual lessons. This presentation is being recorded, and I will send all participants a link to access the recording of this session, and I will send all participants the PowerPoint as well, so you can have a look at it with your staff members. So let's get into it. Challenges in teaching a creating texts unit. One of the big challenges throughout any type of creative unit is students don't have ideas. They find it difficult to know what to write about. They find it difficult to feel confident in writing about anything. Another challenge is that students don't actually write about the idea framework you're studying. They write about ideas that are adjacent to the framework, but not the framework itself. For example, in the idea of country, it's easy to talk about climate change, and climate change is adjacent to the idea of country, but you need to actually talk about the notion of country. Climate change is a vehicle for talking about country. So students can easily fall into the trap of talking about an idea that is adjacent to the big idea, but not the big idea itself. Another challenge that you may have come across this year, if you've been teaching Unit 3 and 4, is that the mentor texts which are listed for study aren't actually the best or most accessible examples of writing to demonstrate to students the different purposes with which they can write. And on that, modeling and teaching different types of writing can be difficult. There are 4 different purposes. How do you kind of model all of those different purposes and the kind of text types that you can use to achieve those purposes? And finally, to finish off all of these challenges, is that kind of implementing effectively this area of study can be a bit of a mess. There are a few things going on. So our challenge at Ticking Minds is to meet these challenges and to make it easier for you as teachers to present this area of study in a way that is understandable for students. So these were the challenges in mind when we sat down to rewrite this chapter from our textbook. So let me talk about some of the principles that we put in place to write this chapter, and the general way this chapter has been laid out. So, a big principle in the layout of this book is this unit plan. If you've been to some of our workshops about VCE English over the last 12 months, we've been talking about this as a template for teaching a craft of texts unit. Firstly, in this unit, we're suggesting you start by introducing the big idea. Okay, so there's nothing radical about this notion. In the first week of crafting text unit, you introduce the big idea. You break that big idea down into smaller ideas. You give kids some questions and some prompts so they can have some initial ideas about the big idea. Kids begin to brainstorm and think about how they might respond to this big idea. So far, so typical. What we're suggesting, which is a bit different though, is that from week 2 onwards, you teach a couple of mini units. Firstly, you spend 1 to 2 weeks teaching a mini unit on persuade and explain writing. That's because these two types of writing overlap a lot, and persuade writing is a type of writing that students are deeply familiar with. So you begin with a type of writing that students are familiar with, and you point out how it's similar in many ways to explain writing, but also there are some key differences. So over 1 to 2 weeks, you look at these two types of writing, you compare features, so you look at some mentor texts, which are examples of these, and you get students to experiment with writing either an explain piece or a persuade piece. Okay, they experiment with one type of writing. Then you move on to a mini unit on express and reflect writing. And we've put these two together because they also overlap. And over the course of a couple of weeks, again, you compare features of these. You look at a mentor text or mentor texts, which are examples of these, and students experiment with one of these types of writing. So at the end of the first 4 weeks of the unit, kids have had a go at either persuade or explain writing, and they've had a go at either express or reflect writing. And then in about week 6, they can actually take one of those pieces that they think is working really well, or that they're really interested in, they feel confident about, and they can polish it up and produce a workshopped piece. And they can write a commentary about the process of producing that piece. Then in week 7, you can get students to respond to a prompt or a stimulus in a kind of exam style SAC task. That gives students practice in doing the type of thing that they're now going to need to do in section B of the exam. So over the course of a 7 to 8 week unit, students spend some extended time workshopping ideas and producing a workshop piece and producing a commentary about that. And they spend a short amount of time responding to a prompt and some stimulus in some exam style practice. So that's a basic unit layout that we had in mind when we designed the new chapter for our textbook, and our textbook is designed to support that type of rollout of a crafting text unit. So what are the kind of pedagogical ideas that underpin this? Firstly, a big idea in the shape of this type of unit that we're suggesting that you roll out is that the primary aim of a creating text unit is to teach students to write for a purpose about a specific idea. So it's not about teaching a specific text type, it's about teaching kids how to write purposefully. So that's why you spend a couple of weeks on persuade and explain writing. So you're teaching kids how to write for those purposes, and you're doing it in a more efficient way by pointing out the links between these two pieces, these two purposes. So that leads me to the kind of second pedagogy that is underlying the way we've set up this chapter, that the purposes all overlap. When you're engaging in expressive writing, you're probably going to be reflecting. And when you're reflecting, you're probably going to be engaging in some expressive writing too. So it makes sense to connect these purposes. When kids engage in any type of writing, there's going to be a primary purpose, but there's also going to be secondary purposes. So it makes sense to point those out. Another really important pedagogical outcome of this unit design that we're proposing is that students should experiment with writing for different purposes. So rather than just saying to students, you all need to write a persuasive piece, or rather than students saying, I'm only going to write a reflective piece, over a few weeks, they should experiment with a couple of different purposes. Okay, students don't know what they're capable of writing. Students don't know what they're going to feel confident or interested in writing about until they actually have a go doing different types of writing. So it's really important that students have a go at a few different types of writing. Mentor texts are also most effective when you look at small sections of them. And later on, I'm going to show you some examples of how our textbook allows you to look at small sections of mentor text, like openings, bodies, and closings, and pick out what's happening in those sections and get kids to have a go writing, doing some short writing using some of those features. Another kind of pedagogical outcome that this unit design is meeting is that over the front part, the first part of the unit, students should spend some extended time workshopping, experimenting with different ideas, and they can choose one of those ideas to polish up and present as a workshop piece. And from the ideas that they experiment and think about over the first few weeks, they can also draw upon those in how they respond to a prompt or a stimulus in a kind of shorter, more exam style period of time. Okay, so that's a bit about the unit design principles and the pedagogical principles that underpin how we've redesigned the crafting texts chapter. Let me kind of take you through a broad overview of this chapter. So firstly, the chapter begins with a flowchart overview like this that is designed to give students a big picture about how this unit is set out. So the first part of this chapter is about how this unit operates, and it's also about what assessment tasks you might be doing, and how kids can initially break down the big idea into smaller ideas. So there are still a range of features in this first part, which are currently in the 4th edition. So the double page spreads that have questions that allow kids to break down protest or country into smaller questions are still there. This checklist on the bottom right-hand corner where kids can think about how they personally think about this big idea is still there. Something new that we've introduced is this checklist of different experiences that students might have over the course of this unit. And I think that's something important to spend some time with students at the beginning of the unit, to point out that it's normal not to have any ideas. It's normal to have too many ideas. It's normal to think that you're not prepared to write about many of these things. So that's the first part of this chapter, the big idea, the experiences they're going to have as writers throughout this, and what the assessment tasks might look like. The middle part of the chapter is the biggest part. That's where there is a section which is essentially a mini unit on persuade and explain writing. Begins by pointing out similarities and differences between these two types of writing, and then gives a range of examples of openings just for persuade and explain writing, and then bodies just for explain and persuade writing, and closings just for persuade and explain writing. So this is a big difference from the current fourth edition, which just has kind of a general range of examples of openings, bodies, and closings. But the new fifth edition kind of has a section specifically about persuade and explain writing, and has a more expansive range of examples of openings, bodies, and closings for those two types of writing. So students have got more examples to look at, and for each of the example openings, bodies, and closings, there is now dedicated practical strategies that students can look at to help them engage with that type of opening, body, and closing. Sentence starters, types of writing techniques that they can use. Okay, so there's a section just on explain and persuade, and then there's a section just on express and reflect. And again, it begins by pointing out similarities and differences between these two types of writing, and then provides a range of examples about how to open, or how to engage in body paragraphs, or how to close this type of writing. And again, it includes specific examples, specific strategies for each of these types of openings, bodies, and closings. So the middle section takes up the majority of this new chapter, and it's really trying to give kids a whole range of different examples of openings, bodies, and closings, and give them very practical strategies about how to go about using those openings, bodies, and closings themselves. Then the final section of the chapter has a section on how to write a commentary or explanation for a workshop piece. And this is different from the fourth edition because now we know that students only need to write a commentary about one piece they've written. The fourth edition has an example commentary about two pieces, but in the fifth edition, the example is just about one piece they've written. So it provides a much more structured and accessible example of the type of thing that students actually need to do. And all of the practical sentence starters and tips for how to engage in this type of writing are set up for students to write a commentary about a single piece they have produced. So that should be much more helpful. Also, there is a section about how to annotate a creative piece that EAL students have produced, because EAL students don't need to write a commentary. They need to annotate a piece they've written and to point out features they've used and to reflect upon those authorial decisions. And we've given a really clear example of how to do that, which is not what is in the current fourth edition, because this kind of thing changed at the last minute in the study design. So we had actually written the EAL section in the current fourth edition before the annotation element was added to the study design. So this is actually way more helpful if you have EAL students, because it shows exactly what they need to do. Okay, so those are some big picture things about how to structure a unit, and those are some examples about how the chapter is laid out to meet those design principles. Let's look at some specific examples of how you'd use this textbook throughout a unit. All right, so on the left-hand side is our suggested way of presenting and structuring a unit. And on the right-hand side are some examples of how you can use our textbook to teach to these different points of the unit. Let me go through and kind of explain some of these in a bit more detail, beginning with how you might use our textbook to introduce a big idea at the beginning of a unit. One of the things we do in our textbook is to have a double page spread at the start that visually signposts to students the sequence of learning that they're going to go through throughout this unit. And I think that is really important at the beginning of a unit to make it clear to students what they need to do at the end, what they need to be able to do by the end, and how they're going through a series of steps to get to that endpoint. And that's why at the beginning of all of the chapters in our textbook, there is a flow chart at the start of each chapter that you can use at the very beginning of a unit to explain to kids the sequence of learning that they're going to engage in. So you might say at the beginning of your crafting text unit, okay, open to page 87. I just want to run down what's going to happen in this unit on turning points that we're doing in year 11. By the end of this unit, you're going to produce a workshop piece and a piece in response to a stimulus. And in order to get there, we're going to go through these steps. Okay, first, I want to make it clear exactly what the assessment will look like. Then over this first week, we're going to break down this big idea into smaller ideas. You're going to have some initial responses and then etc., etc., etc. So making sure that kids are clear about what they're going to engage in and why over the course of the unit is really important. That's how their learning becomes purposeful. They know why the sequence of learning exists in the way it does. And this might be something that you come back to regularly throughout a unit. You might say at the beginning of week 2, okay, if we just flip over to week 87, if we flip over to page 87, okay, we've done steps 1 and 2, okay? You're clear about the assessment at the end. We've unpacked the idea. We're now on to step 3, and we're going to begin by looking at persuade and explain writing for a week and a half or so. So you can't be too clear with kids about how you're progressing throughout a unit. So that's how the opening double page spread works. It's something that I know teachers and students will often ignore. You want to kind of just gravitate to the practical stuff or the sentence starters and vocab lists. But this visual layout is actually really important to help kids track the progress of their learning. Okay, so clarify for kids exactly what the assessment looks like. It might not be exactly what we've said on page 89, and probably be some type of variation of that. Have a look at this checklist of experiences that students might have. Anticipate challenges and normalize those challenges, so kids know that that they're not stupid if they're finding it difficult to come up with ideas. That there's nothing wrong with being uninterested about writing about anything. All of these are normal experiences, and if we anticipate them, kids can move past them without seeing them as major hurdles that completely block their progress. Okay, in addition to that, in the first section of the textbook is also a whole range of question grids that will help you break the big idea down into smaller grids, and they carry over from the current 4th edition. Let me move on to how you can use our textbook to teach these mini units on persuade and explain writing, or express and reflect. So at the beginning of the second week of a unit on crafting text, you might say to students, okay, over the next week or so, we're going to be looking closely at explain and persuade writing. And we're looking at these two types of writing together because they're actually closely connected. They really overlap. So what I want you to do is I want you to flip over to page 99, and we're just going to have a bit of a look at some of the information on the left-hand side. Okay, So we can look through this. So persuasive writing, from the first dot point, we see that persuasive writing, we know clearly it's about trying to convince an audience to think or act in a specific way. Explainer writing is trying to present information in a way that helps the audience understand the topic. So, that suggests that they're different. But if we actually kind of look a bit further, let's have a look at the language features. Persuasive and explaining writing actually share many characteristics because they both aim to show the impact or importance of facts. Because explainer writing wants an audience to understand information and see that information is actually important to understand. Persuasive writing also deals a lot in facts because you know that in any persuasive piece, you're going to give examples and you need to make those facts and information understandable to an audience so they understand why they should be persuaded by those facts and examples. So there's a range of overlaps between these two types of writing. So let's have a look at some of the language features on the right-hand side, and you can begin to point those out. Okay, so in the middle column are words that persuasive writing and explainer writing often share. But on the left-hand side, you can see that persuasive writing presents often stronger versions of those because it wants you to think positively or negatively about ideas and information which are being presented. On the right-hand side is the type of more neutral language that explainer writing often uses because it's trying to present information, not to form your opinion about how you should think positively or negatively about that, but just to help you understand what it means so you can make up your own mind. So that's how you kind of, use this opening double page spread to talk about the overlap between these two types of writing. And then you say, okay, let's have a look at an example mental text. So let's get out the speech by Tim Winton that we're doing. If you're doing the unit on play, you'll know the mental text I'm talking about. Or let's get out the article about queer pride. And if you do the unit on protest, you'll know the article about queer pride protests that I'm talking about. So I want to look just at the opening of this piece. And do you think the opening is more persuasive or more explainer? Do you think it's using language that is stronger and trying to make us think positively or negatively about the idea? Or do you think it's more explainer writing? It's trying to present things in a more neutral way that is aiming to help us just understand it. So kids can have a think about that and they can circle features within the opening of a mentor text that they think is proof of it being persuasive or explainer, and then you can unpack that. And you can say, okay, well, it's this opening is really providing background, or it's really doing these two types of things. How's it similar to the example in the textbook of providing background or context? Is it similar or is it different? Let's have a look at some other examples of how you might open persuasive or explainer pieces. Now what I want you to do is I want you to think about an idea you have for writing a persuasive or explainer response to the idea that we're studying, and I want you to have a go just writing an opening. I want you to choose one of the opening strategies from pages 102 to 105, and I want you to have a go using some features from that type of opening to write your own opening, which is persuasive or which is explainer. So for each type of opening, we give two versions of it. We give a version that's more persuasive and we give a version that is more explainer. So kids can think about what they're trying to do. So I might say to students, okay, so we're doing protests. I'll give you an example off the top of my head of how I might use the engage with audience strategy to write an opening to my protest piece, where 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 I kind of argue that we need to actually listen to protests. So I might use one of these opening sentences, sentence starters down there. We've all been there, stuck, stuck behind protesters, thinking, "What even is this stupid protest about?" And just thinking about our own convenience and being irritated with the march. But what if what if we stopped and listened to what they were saying, and then I can go on and give an example. So I kind of give an example of my idea and how I'm actually using the techniques or strategies suggested to write that. And I think throughout a crafting text, it's really important for you as a teacher to share your own examples of doing the writing that you expect kids to, and your own examples of engaging with the techniques that the textbook suggests. So you give your own example, then students have a go. And once they've had a go writing an opening, then it's a chance for them to kind of reflect, okay, now you've written your opening, I want you to kind of read through it. I want you to swap it with a peer. I want you to think about, what are you actually doing? Do you think now you've written your opening that you're actually explaining more or persuading more? So you might have set out to persuade, but when you look back through it, do you think your language is actually more neutral and you're explaining things? Or do you think your language is a bit stronger and you're persuading? And this is really important. And one of the reasons I think it's really essential to teach persuasive and explainer writing together is because you'll have a lot of kids who think they're engaging in persuasive writing, but they're actually not. When they look through their piece, the language is actually reasonably neutral. So they're actually explaining. And that is something that you should harness. Okay, how often have you said to kids, your language isn't persuasive enough? Your persuasive piece doesn't have enough warmth. As English teachers, we spend a lot of time saying that to kids over years 7 to 10. But in year 11, we can actually harness the fact that their language doesn't have a lot of warmth and suggest that actually, even though you set out to write a persuasive piece, you're actually really explaining it. You're explaining why protest is important, or you're explaining why looking after country is important. Okay, you want people to understand the facts and make up their own mind, and that's a really important realization. So something that can happen from putting these two outcomes together, explain and persuade, is kids actually realize that even though they set out to do one thing, in fact, what they're doing is another thing. So kids have a go and they think about what they're actually doing. And then I would suggest that they have a go experimenting. Kids find this really difficult. Once they've written something one way, they want to keep it like that. But you have to really challenge them. Okay, you had to go using the engage with the audience opening strategy, but now I want you to have a go using another strategy. This is really important. So you don't know what's going to work best until you actually have a go trying something in a different way. And kids will be surprised that when they try something a different way, actually this second way works a lot better. Oh, actually no, the first way works a lot better. Or actually I can use a bit of both. So once kids have a go doing things in two different ways, they can think about what works best. They can swap with a peer and give each other some advice about what works best. They can step back and think about, actually, what's the purpose with which I really feel most comfortable and interested in? Now I've had to go writing things in a couple of ways. Actually, am I more interested in explaining than persuading, or am I more interested in persuading than explaining? So then you'd proceed to look at bodies and closings. And as you go along, you'd look at a body section from a mentor text. and then the mentor text in the textbook itself. So all of these little examples, and there's lots of them, they're mentor texts too. And we've really kind of structured those mentor texts and put them in bite size to make them accessible to students, and written them in a way that provides kids formulas that they can respond and use in their own writing. Okay, so you'd spend a few weeks on that, and by the end, you want students to have a go writing about one idea they're interested in either persuade or explain mode. And then over the next few weeks, you look at express and reflect writing. Okay, similar deal. You start by looking at the opening page spread, and you talk about the similarities and differences between express and reflect. And you'd say to students that when you're kind of expressing and reflecting, there's a lot of overlap. Okay, you're going to be describing things, you're going to be sharing and relating experiences. Both of those things happen in express and reflect writing. Where they differ is that expressive writing tends to focus more on showing what an idea looks like and feels like, whereas reflective writing tends to focus more on telling. So on the right-hand side, there's a couple of examples, okay? There is a similar thing being written about in each of these examples, but the expressive writing focuses more on showing. The reflective example focuses more on telling. So just have a look through the expressive example, and what is an example of one or two words or one or two phrases or sections that really show by describing what something feels like, sounds like. And then have a look through the reflective writing, and what's an example of words which really tell what something feels like. So kids have a go at that, and then you might have a look at a mentor text and look at the opening of a mentor text, and you might think about what are examples of language in this mentor text that show, or what are examples of language that tell. And you can talk about, is this example more expressive or reflective? Then you can have a think about, does this opening for a mentor text use one of these strategies? Which strategy does it use? Does it start by describing a setting, describing a person or character? So once kids are kind of clear about the overlap but differences between express and reflect writing, they can think about, well, what's an idea they have that they could either express or reflect on, and what are they more interested in doing? Expressing, writing some type of story or piece that shows an idea, or are they more interested in telling, okay, by kind of relating and telling their personal experience about an idea. Okay, and then you can go through and look at the openings, bodies, and closings and get kids to experiment with writing different openings, bodies, and closings in either expressive or reflect mode. Just like for persuasive and explainer, we've got lots of examples of how to open, how to write body paragraphs, and how to close, and lots of really practical tips and strategies about how to engage in those. So kids can spend a week and a half doing that, and by the end, they've had to go writing a piece. Then at the end of that process, with kids have had to go experimenting with explain and persuade or reflect and express, then you can say to kids, all right, now I want you to think about one of the pieces of writing that you've had to go doing over the past few weeks. Which of those ideas do you think you're really interested in, or you really felt like you could do something, you could write more? And I want you to take that and polish it up. And before we polish it up, I want you to kind of look back through that idea that you're interested in writing about. And I want you to think through, what exactly is your purpose in this piece? And I want you to flip to page 96, and we're going to have a look at some example purpose statements where we're making it really clear what's the exact purpose that we're writing for. And you can get kids to write out an exact purpose statement, because they will redraft and refine their piece more clearly when they're very specific about the idea and how they're trying to express a specific, or how they're trying to persuade or explain or reflect on a very specific idea. And page 96 breaks down how to do that, and you can get kids to write out a specific purpose statement, and with that specific purpose statement in mind, they can have a go writing a second draft, or first using BAR or some of the other strategies we outline in the edit and refine section, to think about what they can change about their draft to make it better and to meet what their purpose statement is. So kids have a go doing that, and they polish up their piece. They get some peer feedback. They get feedback from you. They bring their piece to a point where they've really polished it, and they present that. And then they can explain the decisions that they went through. Okay, and that's where you can take kids through the example of an explanation. Okay, that's in the back half of the chapter, and it gives kids a really clear example: introduction and body paragraphs and sentence starters that they can choose from to write their piece. One of the things I do when I give kids big lists of sentence starters like this is, after we've looked through the example and talked about it a bit, I get kids to kind of put a tick or a circle around the sentence starters that they think they might use in their own opening or introduction or their own body paragraphs. And you can do the same, of course, for showing our students how to annotate their piece. Okay, so you've kind of taken kids through a few weeks of experimenting with ideas and then choosing one idea that they feel confident with, which they polish up and present as a workshop piece, and they explain that process. And then over the last part of the unit, you might get kids to respond under kind of more exam type conditions to a stimulus. And our textbook now has a section about exam style stimulus with some tips about how to respond to that. One of the things I'd say about responding to prompts is, over the course of a creating text unit, kids are going to develop a whole range of ideas. The piece that they finally kind of workshop and develop for a workshop piece might be an idea that is a bit more complex, and they need a bit more time to kind of do over a week or so, polish up, and they need a chance to have more feedback about that. Whereas when they respond to a prompt, they're going to be using ideas that they've thought about over weeks 1 to 6, but it might be an idea that they're more confident writing about quickly, in a 2-period situation. And that might be a personal reflective piece or a persuasive piece. So it might be writing in reflective mode or persuasive mode. So it's a style that they're more confident writing in quickly. Whereas the workshop piece might be something they do in express or explain mode, because that's something that is perhaps a bit harder or a bit less familiar with to them. So that's something I encourage kids to think about, doing a writing piece that's a bit harder for their workshop piece that they need a bit more feedback on, and choosing to write for a purpose or in a mode that they're a bit more comfortable in for the prompt response section. Okay, so it's nearly time for me to come to an end. A few details about the Senior English Writing Handbook. It's the same price, the new edition. It will be available to buy from the beginning of term 4. In fact, it will be available for pre-order from the start of September, but orders will be filled from the start of term 4. If you currently book this textbook, there's nothing you need to do. Your book list provider will automatically update your book list to be the new edition 5. If you don't currently book list the Senior English Writing Handbook and you are interested in book listing it, you simply need to give the name of the book and the publisher name, which is us, ticking mine to your book list provider, and they will do all of the rest. You might also be interested in getting class sets. So the Senior English Writing Handbook 4th edition, we're selling discounted class sets of those because all of the chapters, apart from the creative writing chapter or the creating text chapter, are actually the same. It's the creating text chapter that we've changed fundamentally, so it's more useful. But if you find all the other chapters useful and you don't necessarily want to book list it, but you do want kids to have access to some of the great strategies and resources of the textbook, consider getting a class set pretty cheaply. And you can find out more information about ordering a class set from this link here. Thank you very much for listening today. If you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to put those into the chat function and I will address those. Otherwise, I will send out a copy of this presentation and a link to the recording to you tomorrow. Thanks very much for joining me today to hear about the new edition of the Senior English Writing Handbook.